Please give a warm welcome for Margaret Kress.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Chicky, and good afternoon, everyone. It really is, I'm very grateful to be up here speaking with you and to introduce you to the Treaty Commissioner of Manitoba. And I feel blessed to welcome James Wilson to Wolastoqey territory. And in doing this, I honor his knowledges from the West. So thank you, Jamie, for coming and for taking the time to be with us through this few days. Also, I wish to acknowledge the territories that he is from in Manitoba, where he lives in Winnipeg, and that is Treaty 1 territory, and also the homelands of the Métis Nation. And also my homelands. And I also want to recognize his home in Opaskwayak Cree Nation, which is in northern Manitoba and within Treaty 5 territory. So it is in the beautiful lands of northern Manitoba, and I like to say Saskatchewan is also, because we're kind of border people out there, he and I. And so I would like to acknowledge his territories as well today. Jamie Wilson is a progressive young leader, and as I said, he's from Opaskwayak Cree Nation. He has been able to move with ease among many communities, and in particular, First Nations communities and the settler communities. And he does that with the capacity of what one of your elders, Elder Marshall, has indicated, that there is this way of understanding, and it's referred to as two-eyed seeing. And I think what we're looking for in Treaty Commission and Treaty Commissioner knowledge is a way in which we can look at the world from two perspectives or two eyes. And he does that in a capacity that makes everyone feel welcome. The other thing about Jamie is he is an educator. For those of you in the room that didn't know that he is an educator, he was the Director of Education up in northern Manitoba in the Pawbat for Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and I think it was John Ross School. Is that correct, Jamie? Joe A. Ross School. And so that's an important thing to acknowledge, that Jamie is an educator. He's brought that understanding to the Office of the Treaty Commission. The other thing is that he is a gifted athlete. He is a paddler, which I think is just one of the most wonderful things in the world, and all of us should become paddlers if we're not so right now. All of his children, his family, they're all engaged in environmentalism and in active protection and use of the land in ways like paddling. So I think that's important to see. He's a facilitator, he's a relationship builder, he knows how to navigate complex situations and discussions. He's worked with many people. He's in his second mandate as the Treaty Commissioner of Manitoba, and he has an extensive knowledge base about treaty development, and he's using that to bring it to a contemporary sense, in that he is looking at further education opportunities, he's looking at economic development, he is looking at the bridging of elder knowledge with youth knowledge. So there's a number of things that he is doing to make this Canada a better place for all of us, wherever we are from. The other thing is he has served on many councils and committees. He's currently serving on the Mayor's Committee in the city of Winnipeg. And I don't know if many of you or all of you are familiar with many of the issues around Indigenous missing and murdered women, but the issues of racism that exist within our western provinces where we are from, but also across Canada in varying degrees of subtleties and in some cases overtness. So he's been working with the Mayor's Commission to address some of these issues in the prairies and throughout Canada. He's also a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, and those of you that don't know it, he stayed up late last night trying to write a column, and he can tell you more about that maybe in his presentation. The last thing that I'd like to tell you is that Jamie is married to Kristen Erickson, and they have 3 wonderful children who are also athletes, Jessica and Neven. I feel blessed to have met Jamie some time ago, but to have a relationship with his family, his parents, Dr. Peggy and Dr. Stan and Elder Stan Wilson, I've known for quite some time, and his dad has given me a lot of good advice, and he's given me the nuances and understandings of the Cree language, and particularly the Swampy Cree dialect. So I'm blessed to have a relationship with Jamie Wilson's father. Additionally, his brother, Dr. Sean Wilson, is the writer of research at ceremony. So that's an important feature for you to understand, that Jamie is grounded in an understanding of Indigenous research methodologies. And finally, I feel extremely blessed to have a relationship with his sister, Dr. Alex Wilson, who is the Director of Research, Aboriginal Research at the University of Saskatchewan. And Alex and I she has supported me, she's been my mentor, my teacher, my co-supervisor in many capacities, and she has told me a lot of things over the years. But one of the important things that Jamie Wilson brings to you today is something that she told me some time ago, and I'm going to hopefully pronounce it right. It is in the Swampy Cree language, and the phrase is Kakanoia Wagamakanak, and it means that together to get today, we're all here together, and that it is in this degree that in which we are all related, that we are going to move forward to make a change. And I am just so pleased today to bring to you the Treaty Commissioner of Manitoba, Jamie Wilson.
I'm speechless because I can't believe my sister said anything positive about me. Big sisters, I don't know if any of you are little brothers in here, but you know what it's like, eh? Thank you very much for the introduction. I wanted to acknowledge again the territory that I'm on, Maliseet territory and Mi'kmaq territory. I think it's a significant thing to acknowledge. If you're, one thing that you'll notice if you've been following Winnipeg in the news is we're struggling with dealing with this significant racism problem in the province right now. It's nothing new, of course, but the acknowledgement of it is something that's quite new. The acknowledgement of it in the mainstream society is pretty new, and the acknowledgement of territory is something that started to happen probably within the last 3 to 5 years in Manitoba. You'll hear now, so the Mayor Brian Bowman, when he was inaugurated, he was the first mayor, first Aboriginal mayor that Winnipeg's had. He did an acknowledgement of territory. The brand new Lieutenant Governor of the province when she was inaugurated, did an acknowledgement of territory. University of Manitoba, University of Winnipeg. If you go to any events, they'll do an acknowledgement of territory. Even if you go to a Bomber game now, before O Canada, when everybody's standing, they'll do an acknowledgement of territory. It's something it's becoming widespread, and it seems like a small thing, but it's a big thing. And I'm going to try to explain that, and I'm going to try not to hit this too. So I work as the Treaty Commissioner. I don't know where my binder went that was up here. My folder? I had notes up here, but anyway. Well, you got them. You took them. No, it's a very rough guide.
Just pretend I'm your big sister.
So the Treaty Relations Commission in Manitoba, I want to share some lessons about kind of the value of a treaty commission, some of the struggles we've had, the challenges we've had, and I think we have some lessons learned that could be shared across Canada. So we were, and most importantly, I wanted to share with you a couple of stories of some students in Manitoba. That's my passion is as an educator. I want to share some stories about two different groups of students. There's going to be some overlap between today and what Judge Arnott said yesterday. So I'm going to try to go through that overlap bit as quickly as possible. And I'm going to try to stick to my time constraints. So we were created in 2005 through a joint mandate between the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the federal government. The federal government being represented through Aboriginal Affairs, Northern Development Canada. So the negotiations started in 2003. MOU was signed in 2005, which created a modern day treaty commission. So our reporting structure is basically, I report both to the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Derek Nepanak, and to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Northern Development Canada, who we'll find out on the 4th who that minister will be. Our budgeting, our work plans, everything goes through both of those parties and gets vetted through both of those parties. So we are an independent federal agency, but we're unique, very unique in that we have a joint reporting structure, and that's key. I think we're the only, well, us and OTC would be the only federal agencies that I know of that have a joint federal joint reporting structure. Now, so the first commissioner, 2005, was Dennis Whitebird. When he was appointed, one of the key things that we wanted to do was education initiative, get kids kindergarten to grade 12 learning about treaties, following the lead of OTC in Saskatchewan. Now, when they started developing resources, one of the things they would do, we would hire educators. Educators would write up resources. We would send it to AMC to get vetted. They would make changes to it. We would send it to the federal government to make changes. They would change what AMC changed, make other changes, send it back. AMC would rechange the change that ANC made, kind of back and forth, back and forth. And it took us a while to realize that, okay, our job as a treaty commission is not to say, here's the one perspective on treaties. Our job is, as a treaty commission, is to say, here are the multiple perspectives on treaties. And the last 2 days have really kind of been an example of what that looks like. So now anything that we produce as a commission, our teacher resources will say, here's the elders' perspective. Here is the First Nations perspective. Here is the legal perspective. Here's the historical perspective. Here's the government's perspective. Even within government, here's the Department of Justice perspective. So now we can't have the federal government saying, no, that's not the First Nations perspective. And likewise, we can't have First Nations saying, no, that's not the government perspective. Educators have really appreciated this. They feel it gives our resources a real sense of balance and strength that they can really build on. So that's one thing I really wanted to touch on. Another thing that gives us a significant amount of strength, I believe, as a commission is that we have an elders council that acts as, so I report to the minister and to the Grand Chief. I have an indirect, if you're looking at kind of org charts, I have an indirect line through an elders council that has elders representing every treaty area in Manitoba. So the elders council acts both in an advisory role to myself and our office and to the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. So the elders council, we basically as an office through this, it's like a formal informal structure. We'll kind of take everything to the elders, get their feedback, and they really keep us grounded and kind of keep us going in the right direction. I'm very much, as an administrator and former military, I'm very much about outcomes, and you value what you measure what you value, and I'm always pushing measurables, stuff like that. The elders are always telling me, just kind of, they rein me in a bit, right? And they say, just so that, I think that's critical to the success of our office, is that elders council. Now we have our mandate is to re-strengthen, rebuild, and enhance the treaty relationship. And we've been talking about the last few days about what a treaty relationship is. But In our mandate, there's 3 pillars: education, research, and facilitation. I'm going to talk real quickly about facilitation and research, and then go in depth about education. Facilitation, we act as we facilitate a dialogue between First Nations and the federal government, provincial government, and business. The area where there's the most growth for us is in facilitating a dialogue between First Nation and business. There's not a lot in Manitoba, not a lot of, there's not, the business community in Manitoba doesn't have a lot of networking and expertise in dealing with First Nations communities, and likewise, there's not a lot of networking opportunities for First Nations in Manitoba. So we're doing little things like, small things like from as small as a Subway owner wanting to open a Subway in Saguin First Nation to big dialogues between Lockheed Martin and different business development corporations on First Nations in Manitoba. So that's a real area of growth for us. Research, we've got 2 big projects on the go. One is an oral history project where we interviewed over 200 elders from all across Manitoba, 5 different language groups, and transcribed their testimony. So it's a series of books. If you saw the book that Judge Arnott spoke about yesterday, it's basically modeled off that, where we have their testimony in their language, and then on the other side of the page is their testimony in English. 4 different subject areas. The first 2 books have been released already. The 3rd book will be released by Christmas, and the 4th book will be released by March 31st. All of those available through McNally Robinson and through our education initiative. Second research project is an atlas. It's a big coffee table atlas with plates on and maps. So there's one map of Manitoba, and then kind of overlaying that, you can look at fur trade routes, where the residential schools were in the province, where the TB sanatoriums were in the province, the treaty areas, some different vignettes of communities, Anishinaabe constellations. There's some really interesting plates within there. Both of those resources, as they're finished, go and feed into the kits that teachers get as part of the education initiative. So under education, and this is probably the biggest part of our mandate. So we operate on a budget of $1.3 million a year. The vast majority of that goes towards our education initiative. So we do 2 days training where teachers will get immersed for 2 days in hearing from historians, elders, legal experts, fellow educators about what treaties are and how to implement treaty education in the classroom. At the end of the 2 days, the teachers get a kit. It's actually a big Tupperware tub now, because we've got, I think, $550 worth of resources in each kit. We're trying to get around 3 in each school. Once they get the training, they get the kit, and then they go in and implement treaty education in their classrooms. And what we did is we started in grades 5 and 6. Grade 5 in Manitoba, you learn Canadian history pre-Confederation. Grade 6, you learn Canadian history post-Confederation. So we started there, and then we did K to 4, and then we did 7 to 12 2 years ago. Each time working with a working group, piloting, getting feedback, all that stuff. So we've trained in Manitoba now, I think we're at 1,600 teachers out of 15,000 teachers in the public school system, and we're in just under 500 of the 900 schools in the province. So it's a rapidly expanding area, and we've had really, really strong feedback from teachers on the ground. They really support the initiative because we're giving them resources that they can use the day they get back to their school. Their teachers are using this. And the big problem we have now is the teachers are taking them when they move schools and stuff like that. It's a good problem to have. There's strong enough resources that teachers are stealing them and that's all that stuff. So, and if you're teachers, you know what it's like. You steal resources when you can find them. So I wanted to share a story of 2 different groups of students because to me, the difficulties that we've had in the relationship between First Nations and other Canadians, the dysfunction in the relationship that we have, the way forward to me has been laid out by young people. It's been laid out by young people that are starting to gain an understanding of what this relationship should look like. And I want to give you 2 examples of that. So the first is a group of students here from a school called Toulon Collegiate. It's a high school in Interlake, Manitoba. and their teacher, Siobhan Faulkner. So this is Miss Faulkner here on the left. Miss Faulkner did 2 days training. She got her kit. She went back to her school. And she started working with a group of students that you could characterize them as high risk, highly disengaged high school students, right? Signing up for class, dropping out, low attendance, low marks, all of that stuff. And there was 2 students in particular. The one to her immediate left, his name's Alex Knott. And his best friend, who's in the far back, his name's Chris. Alex and Chris, one Aboriginal, one non-Aboriginal, best friends, have been friends for a long time, really disengaged. And there was something about what they were learning and this concept of we're all treaty people that just keyed into them. It got them really, really engaged. And their attendance started going up. They started asking their teacher for more. They wanted to learn more. And of course, Miss Faulkner, being a good teacher, she kept pushing them. She's like, okay, how are you going to share what you're learning? How are you going to make a difference with what you're learning? This group of 2 became a bigger group. They kind of formed this social justice club. And the impact that these 2 made has been quite significant, but I'm going to hold off to tell you the impact until the end. Now, the second group of students is a group of students. Second group that I want to share is a group of students from an independent school in Winnipeg. It's called St. Mary's Academy. St. Mary's Academy it's a Catholic school, stereotypically very affluent, engaged students, and the journey. So what happened is in grade 11 at St. Mary's. So in grade 11 in Manitoba curriculum, you do Canadian history. At St. Mary's, what they do is they focus on one area of Canadian history for the whole year, and at the end of the year, they do a Heritage Fair presentation. So these students were told at the beginning of the year, you're going to spend the whole year studying the Indian Act. So a whole cohort, there's around 108 students in that grade 11 year. They were told at the beginning of the year, okay, you're going to be studying this for the whole year. There's a group of students actually went to their teachers at the beginning of the year and said, can we study something else? None of us are Aboriginal. This is an old piece of legislation, it's really irrelevant to us. We'd like to study something that can help us more in our careers kind of moving forward, right? Teacher said, no, we're spending the year studying the Indian Act. So they spent the year listening to, and we were, as an office, we were involved through coordinating, bringing in speakers and elders and creating a real strong dialogue with the students. So we brought in, again, historians, ceremonial leaders, elders. We had panel discussions. And these students, through the course of the year, to see the level of engagement and this capturing of what it means, this concept of we're all treaty people. As an educator, it was just a profoundly moving experience to see these light bulb moments in over 100 young grade 11 students. Since then, the work that these students have done has again gone beyond them as individuals, and it's created a significant impact in the province of Manitoba. But you have to wait to the end to share with you, to see the impact that they made. So what did they learn? And this is the part I'm overlapping with Judge Arnott, so I'm going to try to go through this as fast as I can. So they learned that where they are was Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 was signed August 3rd, 1871 at Lower Fort Garry. You had around 1,500 First Nations gathered at Lower Fort Garry for negotiations with the Crown to give the First Nation saying, we will give you access to the land. And if you noticed yesterday, Judge Arnott said access to the land. It's a significant phrase. We'll give you access to the land in exchange for certain rights and guarantees. Education that he talked about, going forward from that, you had training in carpentry, training in agriculture, agricultural implements, seeds. So the treaties were viewed as about creating opportunities, right? And historians keep emphasizing this. The treaties are not about the past, they're about the future. It's about creating opportunities for the future. So I really quickly want to talk about why did First Nations sign the treaties, and then why did the government sign the treaties. So First Nations have a long history of treaties, as you know. If you can imagine the first European settlers arriving in North America, they were encountering a dynamic network of treaties that had to do with trade, that had to do with rights of passage through territory, treaties that had to do with military alliances, neutrality. So it wasn't something that was new. And in Western Canada, the Hudson Bay Company adopted a lot of those protocols in the fur trade. So the Hudson Bay Company, when they entered the fur trade, when they started trading, so when they set up that York factory, let's say in northern Manitoba, they had basically chiefs that acted as their agents that controlled the fur trade for a significant period. When they would bring furs to York factory, they wouldn't just show up and say, okay, here's your furs, where's my money? We're talking sometimes days of protocols before they would get into the actual trade. Exchange of gifts, ceremonies. You had the Hudson Bay Company giving over a medicine chest, training in what are the contents of this medicine chest. You had some real significant protocols that happened before trade happened. And these were First Nations practices, right? HBC wouldn't have existed without adopting a lot of these practices. There's a famous dialogue between a Mohawk leader and a Jesuit priest. The Jesuit priest says to the Mohawk leader, peace is constant until war is declared. And the Mohawk leader says, no, you have it backwards. War is constant until peace is declared. It was an understanding that conflict between groups is easy, but peace between groups takes concerted, ongoing effort and negotiation, right? And we had protocols attached to those negotiations, and we had that was our practice of treaty making. And I wanted to use I won't get into depth on this, but an example between the Blackfoot Confederacy led by Crowfoot and the Cree, a treaty that was negotiated in the mid 1800s, and Poundmaker. So Crowfoot and Poundmaker ending years of hostilities between the two groups. So it's a practice that's been happening amongst First Nations for hundreds and thousands of years. So it was nothing new. When they went to Lower Fort Garry, they weren't the negotiations that happened weren't new to them. So they brought, and you have now legal experts like M.A. Kraft at the University of Manitoba that talk about Indigenous law that we talked about briefly this morning. First Nations had their legal history of treaties, right? They had their own Indigenous history of treaty making, their own backpack full of history going to those negotiations. The Crown comes with a different background. So legally, we have the Royal Proclamation, 1763 again, which was talked about yesterday. Royal Proclamation, really I think the best way to look at it is it's like an omnibus bill that cuts spending and raises taxes at the same time. So there will be no settlement past the Appalachian Mountains. Services beyond the Appalachian Mountains will be cut off to save money, and we're going to start raising taxes amongst the 13 colonies. As we know, one of the leaders of this, as an aside, one of the leaders in one of the colonies, a gentleman from Virginia, was quite put off by this Royal Proclamation. Anyone want to guess who that was? Significant player in U.S. history?
Jefferson.
George Washington. Yeah, he had plans to settle land west of the Appalachians. And the Royal Proclamation really thwarted a lot of those plans. It's a really significant document. So the Royal Proclamation says if you want to acquire land, here's the steps you have to follow. You have to sign a treaty. It can only be the Crown. A fur trader couldn't go to a trapper and say, can I buy your trap line off you? Had to be the Crown. The negotiations had to be public. There had to be annuities attached to it. So Canada has this legal history, and if Canada wants to acquire land, they have to go through a treaty process. From a legal perspective, the Royal Proclamation is ratified a year later at the Treaty of Niagara. Politically, so that's from a legal perspective. Politically, Sir Johnny MacDonald's the Prime Minister of Canada. He has his national plan, again, as we talked about yesterday. He sends out treaty commissioners. The unmentioned part of his national plan was that he had to get treaties signed. So he sends out commissioners. The commissioners get treaties signed with First Nations in the West. And as settlement moves west, the treaties become less about peace and friendship and less about military alliances and more about the government acquiring access to the land. And there's a lot of historical records about the government not wanting to go into treaty negotiations until there's either resources found on the land or there's some reason for them to want to gain access to the land. And again, I'm saying gain access, I'm not using the word cede, surrender, or relinquish, because that's still being debated today, right? As we saw. So there's over 70 historic treaties signed between First Nations and the government. In areas, if you look at this map, you can see significant areas of Canada where there's no historic treaties. So we have still today, the government of Canada has a legal obligation to sign what are called modern day treaties or comprehensive land claim settlements. James Bay Agreement would be an example of one, or the Nunavut Settlement Agreement would be an example of another one. Treaty 1 is a 4-page document, right? You had First Nations and the federal government. The modern day negotiations are not 4-page documents anymore. And it's not First Nations and the federal government, it's First Nations and the federal government, provincial government, and third-party interests. So we're talking about some really complicated, expensive, ongoing negotiations that are happening today. So the treaties were mutually negotiated, both sides coming with their own legal traditions, both sides figuring out a way to create an enduring relationship of mutual obligation towards each other. And there were a number of communities, I'm going to focus on southern Manitoba. There's a number of communities that really embraced what this new partnership should look like and what was supposed to have come out of it. There's a number of communities that really embraced farming, as an example. Around the Verdon area in Manitoba, you had a number that had invested in farming equipment, farming machinery, communal property, and they were doing quite well in an era when farming was not doing quite well, as it generally. So if we fast forward from that era to today, we know that something changed in the relationship, right? And that thing that changed the relationship is what those St. Mary's students spent the year studying. It was the Indian Act. So the Indian Act was introduced in 1876. Through the Indian Act, we have the pass system, again, that we talked about yesterday, that's introduced. We have Indian agents that are introduced who control everything that happens on the reserve. We have the outlawing of ceremony. We have the outlawing of big ceremonies. And in practice, we have Indian agents. Like in northern Manitoba, you'll hear stories of the Indian agents rounding up every ceremonial object in the community, drums, rattles, pipes, and taking them out to an island and either burying them or burning them. We have the right to vote taken away from First Nations people. We have the whole non-access to legal representation for First Nations people, all happening through the Indian Act. We have the residential schools introduced through the Indian Act, where the government subcontracts education to the churches, and we know the impact that's had on Canadians across the country. And we have an interesting one that Sarah Carter at the University of Manitoba has studied is I'm going to back up a bit, the peasant farmer policy. And this is based on the belief that Christianity and civilization are the same thing, right? The government wants to implement policies to Christianize and civilize First Nations people. The thinking was that cultures go through evolutionary stages, the highest stage being civilization. So to move a culture from a hunter-gatherer society to civilization, they have to go through steps. And if you miss steps, you're setting yourself up for failure. Again, this is the thinking that motivated some of these policies. The peasant farmer policy was implemented because the government thought that the communities that were doing well in farming were setting themselves up for failure because they hadn't learned the lessons of manual labor. So they outlawed the use of labor-saving farming equipment on First Nations, so First Nations could only farm with handmade tools. and again, written about by Sarah Carter, fascinating book, and something that's largely unknown, especially amongst farmers and people in the agriculture industry in Western Canada. So we have the dependency that's brought in by the Indian Act. As the rights of most Canadians are increasing, the rights of First Nations people are rapidly decreasing. So and this doesn't start changing until, and again, Judge Arnott spoke about this. We have a number of veterans returning from World War I and World War II. You had, First Nations had the highest volunteerism rates in World War I and World War II. You had people like Tommy Prince, who volunteered, served with distinction, one of Canada's highest decorated soldiers of all time, not just Aboriginal soldiers, but of all soldiers, who came back, were given a taste of equality. And I don't want to say there was no racism in the military, but they're given a taste of what equality looks like, comes back, and Tommy Prince, there's stories of Tommy Prince being forcibly removed from the Legion in Selkirk, just outside of his reserve. Coming from volunteering from a system where he's not even a citizen into the military, where he's treated as an equal, more or less as an equal, and then coming back into a system where he's not even a citizen again. So these guys started to advocate for the rights. So you have the precursor to organizations like the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the Assembly of First Nations that are really pushed by veterans coming out of World War I and World War II. Now, so this is what these students are learning about, right? The treaties, this mutual relationship of obligation and responsibility towards each other, the Indian Act, the impact of the Indian Act. Everybody that learns about the Indian Act wants to get rid of the Indian Act. I've never met someone that's learned about it and then said, yeah, I love the Indian Act. But there's a couple of things the Indian Act does that make our moving ahead challenging. Because you have, so as negotiations moved, the First Nations were communicating with each other, so they would say, okay, we negotiated this with the government. When you meet with the Crown, you start there, and then we'll, and then add on to that, right? So you have Treaty 6, they introduced the medicine chest clause, the practice that goes back to HBC days. Treaty 8, they introduced taxation. It's the first written inclusion of taxation and conscription in the treaty negotiation. So we will agree to give you access to the land, but we will not pay taxes to your government, or we will not be forced into your military. One of the things the Indian Act does, and here's where the problem comes in, is the Indian Act creates a system of pan-Canadian rights for status Indians under the Indian Act. So those things that were negotiated Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 become rights through this pan-Canadian system of rights that everybody that's a status Indian carries. So moving ahead, one of our challenges is what happens to those if we get rid of the Indian Act? Do they go back to the specific treaty areas, or do they stay applicable to everybody? To me, the critical thing is not the answer to that, it's who gets to answer that. Because historically, the problem started when the government unilaterally has imposed answers for First Nations people, when the government unilaterally imposed the Indian Act. So that, as an approach, that system is not going to work. It's got to be, any changes to the Indian Act have to be led by First Nations people in Canada, or it won't be successful. So I'm probably over my time already, aren't I? Yeah, okay. So I left you with two stories about students. I'll start with the St. Mary's students. So these students are immersed in this over the course of a year. We're invited, there's a few of us invited at the end of the year to judge at the Heritage Fair. And to see the level of engagement of these young people was just amazing. As an educator, it's really inspiring. You had young people talking about the access to drinking water. You had young people talking about land claims issues. You had young people talking about women's rights in the Indian Act and how the Indian Act has influenced women's rights. I remember one student sharing, and she said, I was driving downtown with my grandmother, and there was an Aboriginal woman on the street, and my grandmother said something racist about the woman. She said, for the first time, I felt like I had the tools to respectfully educate my grandmother. Another girl who was one of the girls at the beginning of the year who challenged their teachers about studying something other than the Indian Act, talked about now she wants to study Aboriginal law at the University of Manitoba. It was these students saying, I'm not going to leave this relationship up to the Prime Minister and the National Chief. I'm going to be a part of this relationship and take responsibility for it myself. The first thing I can do is learn about my partner. And the amazing thing was the more they learned about their partner in the relationship, the more they learned about themselves, as Canadians really. And they became highly engaged, young, active citizens, deeply concerned about social justice in Canada. We had 3 of the students present to the Manitoba School Boards Association, AGM. They talked about how this shouldn't be something that you just learn in grade 11, but it should be kindergarten to grade 12. After they spoke, there was a motion from the floor to have treaty education fully integrated in Manitoba, kindergarten to grade 12, and it passed unanimously. Since then, the Manitoba Association of School Superintendents, which represents the superintendents, of course, has adopted a similar position. And the Manitoba Teacher Society, which represents all the public school teachers, has also adopted the same position. Just this last, was it June when the TRC recommendations came out? When the TRC recommendations came out, because of the pressure from these groups, and because of the TRC recommendations, and because of the overwhelming support from teachers, the province of Manitoba announced that they will be introducing legislation before, I'm hoping it comes in before Christmas, legislation to have treaty education and residential school education fully integrated in Manitoba, kindergarten to grade 12. So it'll actually be a legislated part of the curriculum in our province. The group of students from Toulon Collegiate, they started speaking about these issues, right? They went out, they spoke to elementary schools, they did a day within their high school where they shared what they had learned. If you talk to the teacher, and we were kind of involved with them, she said you could just see the demeanor of these young people changing, right? The way they dressed, the way they carried themselves, the way they projected. Since then, especially Alex, so Alex is passionate about clean drinking water, and he's been traveling around the province speaking on access to clean drinking water. He comes from a community called St. Teresa Point. There's 1,400 homes in that area that don't have running water. So he's out speaking on the issues all the time. They were awarded, this was taken at the Manitoba Teachers Society AGM last year. They were awarded a Young Humanitarian Award. Alex has since spoken at 2 TEDx events in Winnipeg. He spoke at We Day in Winnipeg, and I don't know if you're familiar with We Day, but probably 16,000 screaming teenagers, and there was Alex up on stage talking about water issues. And the amazing thing to me, Alex has a speech impediment. His first 2 years in high school, he never talked once. He didn't talk in the hallways, he didn't talk in class. He would only talk really, when people couldn't hear, he would talk to Chris when no one else could hear, he said. So he's now, I get choked up talking about Alex. So he's now so passionate about these issues that, and he feels so strongly that he puts himself so far out of his comfort zone that he's now standing in front of 16,000 of his peers and talking about these issues to everybody else. So to me, they're kind of like the peripheral spin-off benefits of having a treaty commission, but to me, they're the things that really matter, right? As educators, as people with kids, this is the future that we want to see in our provinces. This is the future really that we want to see in Canada. I want to close with one thing. When we're talking about First Nations issues, and we've had this struggle with our teachers, with educators, we're talking about some pretty traumatic histories. It's really easy to burden our students and young people with just the negativity. One thing that we have to do is always give people that sense of hope. If it's unfair of us, and we'll be failing if all we give people is that negativity and that sense of failure. So it's really important that we give young people and give society really a sense of hope. To me, the sense of hope in this relationship is the treaty relationship. It's going back to this nation-to-nation partnership where we have obligations towards each other, where we agreed to work and share with each other to make Canada really a better place. So with that, thank you very much.